Hello. We are now in the last part of our class. So we have done our historical survey of the major ethical philosophies. We've covered virtue ethics, we've covered deontology, and we've covered utilitarianism. And now we're to the point where we're going to look at the application of those things to some modern questions. And we've got two modern questions that we're going to be looking at. They are civil disobedience. And we're looking at civil disobedience largely because of the big protest movements a couple of years ago in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We had protest movements in a lot of American cities and cities worldwide. And so we're going to look at civil disobedience as a question, an ethical question, whether or not that is something that is morally praiseworthy or morally blameworthy. And then the last thing that we're going to look at is abortion. And with the new court ruling overturning Roe versus Wade that happened yesterday, from my perspective, I'm recording this on the 25th, then I don't think we're going to get anything that's more topical than that. Certainly, the question of abortion is going to be on the ballot here in Michigan, at least, and probably many other places as well for the foreseeable future. I'm sure that we'll see it again and again and again. So the first thing that we're going to look at is civil disobedience, though, and we're going to go all the way back to Plato. We're going to go all the way back to Plato, and we're going to take a look at his book, the Crito. And in the Crito, Socrates is going to give an argument for why he does not believe in civil disobedience, why you can never go against the law. Okay, and so this is in our textbook. All these last four essays that we're going to be reading are all in our textbook. We're going to read one ancient one, and then the other three essays that we're going to read are going to be from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So more contemporary stuff. So the scene in the Crito is that Socrates is in prison, and Crito is his friend who comes to visit him. So Socrates is in prison. So we can remember way back at the beginning of the term, just really a few weeks ago, when we read the Euthyphro, that Socrates was being prosecuted for corrupting the youth. Well, it turns out that he was convicted. If you want to get the argument that Socrates gave to the court, that is found in a text called the Apology by Plato. But we're not going to be reading that. I think that the Apology might actually be in our book. No, it's not in our book. But that's where it is if you want that. And so he is here in this book in prison awaiting his execution, and Crito comes to visit him. Now you might ask, why is he waiting? Right? And the answer to that question is found on page 25. Right? And Socrates says on page 25, says, "What, I suppose that the ship has come from Delos, on the arrival of which I am to die." And he says, "No, the ship has not actually arrived, but she will probably be here today, as persons who have come from Sunium tell me that they left her there, and therefore tomorrow, Socrates, will be the very last day of your life." Well, this is interesting. This doesn't tell us anything if we don't know anything about what was going on in Athens. Well, it turns out that when Socrates was convicted of corrupting the youth, they were in the midst of a religious festival. And for this religious festival, they would take this ship out to an island, they would make a sacrifice there, and then they would come back to the island, and they couldn't they come back from the island to Athens, and they couldn't do any executions during the time of the festival, during the time that the ship was gone, because that's when the sacrifice was being made. And the ship that they took was the ship of Theseus. Now, if any of you have watched the recent Disney Plus show, what was that Disney Plus show called? WandaVision. WandaVision. In the last episode of WandaVision, there's actually a reference to the ship of Theseus, and this is the ship, right? Theseus is the mythical founder of the city of Athens, and the ship of Theseus is thought to have been the actual ship. But then there's this other philosophical question about, if the ship is so old and it has to be kept in good repair, and eventually all pieces of the ship are replaced, is it still the ship of Theseus? Well, for the Athenians, it was, because this was the ship that they used to go do this sacrifice, and so that um, that thought experiment about whether or not, if you take all the pieces of the ship of Theseus and you replace them, whether or not it's still the same ship, that that thought experiment is brought up in the last episode of WandaVision. So if you want to go ahead and watch that, it's interesting to see sometimes that philosophy shows up in popular culture, although not terribly often. But that's not relevant to our class. What's relevant to our class is that Socrates was waiting for his execution, and he was in prison, and Crito came to visit him. Right? Crito came to visit him, and the reason why Crito came to visit him was to encourage him to escape. So this would have been the action of Socrates. That would be civil disobedience. That he would escape Athens, never to return. Right? He would choose exile instead of execution. That is the question. Right? His civil disobedience is one really where his life is at stake. Right? And Crito is there to convince him to escape. Right? He says there on the bottom of page 25, for if you die, I shall not only lose a friend who can never be replaced, but there is another evil. People who do not know you and me will believe that I might have saved you if I had been willing to give money, but that I did not care. Right? So he's concerned about his friend Socrates and concerned about his reputation. And he's starting to give arguments to Socrates for why he should escape. Right? So one of these arguments is, well, people will think poorly of me, Socrates, because Crito was a wealthy man and he had connections and he could have helped Socrates to escape. And surely Socrates doesn't want to damage Crito's reputation by refusing to cooperate in these plans. Right? And he says there at the bottom of page 26, he says, fear not, there are persons who at no great cost are willing to save you and to bring you out of prison. And as for the informers, you may observe that they are far from being exorbitant in their demands. A little money will satisfy them. Right? So he's talking about bribing the guards here. My means, which as I am sure are ample, are at your service. And if you have a scruple about spending all mine, here are strangers who will give you the use of theirs. And one of them, Simmias the Theban, has brought a sum of money for this very purpose. Cebes and many others are willing to spend their money too. I say, therefore, do not on that account hesitate about making your escape, and do not say, as you did in the court, that you will have a difficulty in knowing what to do with yourself if you escape. For men will love you in other places to which you may go, and not in Athens only. There are friends of mine in Thessaly, and if you like to go to them, who will value and protect you, and no Thessalian will give you any trouble. So he's revealing the plan here to Socrates. Right? You have people who will help you. You have places to go. People will love you, and these names that come up, Cebes and Simmias. If you read more of the Platonic dialogues, these same figures, these same men, show up in the life of Socrates more than once. But Socrates won't hear of it. On the bottom of page 27, he gives a response. He says, Dear Crito, your zeal is invaluable if a right one, but if wrong, the greater the zeal, the greater the evil, and therefore we ought to consider whether these things shall be done or not. So he's gonna argue. He says, Crito, let's really figure this out. Right? And then on page 28, he says, Shall I return to your old argument about the opinions of men, some of which are to be regarded, and others, as we were saying, are not to be regarded? Right? So what is he saying here? He's saying, don't tell me that people are going to think badly of you. Right? Socrates is not the kind of person who's going to be persuaded by anything but reason. He's not swayed by the opinions of men. And if Crito is a good student of Socrates, he should realize that he likewise should not be swayed by the opinions of men. Right? So let's proceed. Um, so he's talking about not valuing the opinions of men, and then on page 30, he says, "From these premises I proceed to argue the question whether I ought or ought not to try to escape without the consent of the Athenians. And if I am clearly right in escaping, then I will make the attempt, but if not, I will abstain." Right? And so Crito is going to present the case that he should escape. Right? And Socrates is going to argue against him. Socrates on page 31 begins to make his case. He says, "Are we to say that we are never intentionally to do wrong, or that in one way we ought and in another way we ought not to do wrong, or is doing wrong always evil and dishonorable?" Right? So he's getting here at the end of that paragraph. He says, "Injustice is always an evil, and dishonor to him who acts unjustly. Shall we affirm that?" Right? And Socrates says it this way because he knows that Crito is going to agree that it's always wrong to do the wrong thing. And this ultimately is where he's going to be successful in uh, converting Crito, right? Because he's got a plan here ahead of time that you cannot return evil for evil, that your job is always to do the right thing, even if somebody is bad to you. So he gets there in the middle of page 31. He says, "What of doing evil in return for evil, which is the morality of the many? Is that just or not?" And Crito says, "That is not just." Right? Then Socrates at the bottom of page 31 says, "Then we ought not to retaliate or render evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from him." Right? And then on page 32, he gets to the conclusion. He says, "In leaving the prison against the will of the Athenians, do I wrong any, or rather do I not wrong those whom I ought at least to wrong? Do I not desert the principles which were acknowledged by us to be just? What do you say?" And then in the next paragraph thereafter, Crito responds, "I cannot tell." Socrates says, "Do you imagine that a state can subsist and not be overthrown, in which the decisions of law have no power, but are set aside and overthrown by individuals?" He's getting to the point that Crito's objection, right, the reason why he thinks that this civil disobedience in this case, escaping prison, is necessary, is because Socrates suffered an injustice, right? And if Socrates suffered an injustice, then he believes that this is the way to right the injustice for him to escape. But what Socrates is saying is that escaping from prison is always wrong. Violating the orders of your state is always wrong. And even if the state has done an injustice to you, that doesn't justify um, rebellion, right? And so what Socrates is doing is he's equating his escape, or equating civil disobedience, to a form of rebellion. And rebellion is always wrong. Okay? So he continues. And he asks Crito, and this is on the bottom of page 32, "Tell us what complaint you have to make against us which justifies you in attempting to destroy us, the state." Right? So what he's doing, and this is uh, really a good turn, is that Socrates here is kind of conjuring up the spirit of the law. Right? He's conjuring up the spirit of the law to accuse him. To accuse him. And the law is going to tell Socrates what is owed to itself, right? So the law is saying, tell us what complaint you have to make against us. And then the law says, um, because you are attempting to destroy us and the state in the first place, did we not bring you into existence? Right? So Socrates cannot rebel against the law. In the first place, the law brought him into existence, right? Because the law says, your father married your mother by our aid and begat you. Say whether you have any objection to urge against those of us who regulate marriage. None, I should reply, or against those of us who regulate the system of nurture and education of children, in which you were trained. Were not the laws who have charge of this right in commanding your father to train you in music and gymnastics? Right? So the same thing could be said. We have the same laws in America ourselves, right? People marry each other and come into existence through the operation of law. We have the operation of law, which mandates a certain quality of care that parents provide for their children. And then we have laws that require the education and training of children. We have compulsory education in this country. Schools are provided by the law, and if people choose not to participate in those schools, well, then the state has other operations which ensure that children are educated nonetheless. Right? There are laws that pertain to private schools, and there are laws that pertain to homeschooling to make sure that children are brought up. Right? And then the law says to Socrates, well, then, since we brought you into the world and nurtured you, and you were educated by us, can you deny in the first place that you are our child and slave, as your fathers were before you? And if this is true, um, you are not on equal terms with us, nor can you think that you have the right to do with us what we are doing to you. Would you have any right to strike or to revile or to do any evil to a father or to a master if you had one, when you had been struck or reviled by him, or received some other evil at his hands? Would you not say this? And so Socrates here is speaking to an older moral code that we don't really have anymore. But there was this idea, and it's captured in the Ten Commandments in the Decalogue. Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother. But there's this idea that you cannot act out against your father or your mother. Or if you were a slave, and we don't have slavery anymore, you cannot act out against your master. And the law is saying to Socrates that the law itself, the civil society, the state, stands in the place, in fact, stands over and above the father. And just like you cannot act against the father, you cannot act against the state, because that those people brought you into existence. They're responsible for who and what you are. And then at the end of that paragraph, the law asks Socrates, right? It says, but whether in battle or in a court of law or in any other place, he must do what his city and country order him, or he must change their view of what is just. And if he may do no violence to his father or mother, much less must he do violence to his country. The law asks him in the next section there on page 33, consider, Socrates, if this is true, that in your present attempt you are going to do us wrong. Right? You are going to do us wrong. And then on the next page, and this is halfway down, the law reminds Socrates of their relationship. He says, of all Athenians, you have been the most constant resident in the city, which as you never leave, you may be supposed to love, for you never went out of the city either to see the games, except once, when you went to the Isthmus, or to any other place, unless you were on military service, nor did you travel as other men do. Right? And then it says, moreover, you might, if you had liked, have fixed the penalty of banishment in the course of the trial. The state which refuses to let you go now would have let you go then, but you pretended that you preferred death to exile, and that you were not grieved at death, and now you have forgotten these sentiments which pay no respect to us laws, of whom you are the destroyer. So what is he really saying? I think that the mention here of military service, and it's kind of mentioned as an aside in the text, but I think it's really critical to his argument, because what we have, and sometimes it's difficult to kind of relate to things that are really, really ancient, right? So this text is really, really ancient. It's more than 2,000 years old, and societies and states weren't organized then the way that they are now. I mean, certainly there was no such thing as universal citizenship. Athens was a slaves economy. There were people with rights and people without rights, but people didn't even think really in terms of rights, and um, it was not what we expect from our governance today. But one thing was the same, right? And that is that there was military service then, and there is military service now. And then in ancient Athens, your military service was something that could be demanded of you. And in the United States, that is also true. It's not true for everyone, but it also wasn't true for everyone in Athens. But it is true for some people, right? And so in the United States, military service can be demanded of anyone between, I think it's the ages of 18 and 35, right? So when you turn 18, one of the things you have to do is register for the selective service. And what the selective service list is the list of people from whom military service can be demanded. And the United States, in a time of war, can demand military service from all the males between the ages of 18 and 35. That's what a draft is. And even in our society, right, we view that as legitimate. Right? We had a time in the 60s when people were burning draft cards. So, obviously some people don't view it as legitimate, but the main body of Americans view the draft as legitimate. But what they might put limits on it, right? That they think that maybe weren't respected in the 60s, that the Congress has to declare war, that it needs to be a democratic process, blah, blah, blah. But the fundamental premise that your country can demand military service of you is not something that people disagree with. And this is a critical point for Socrates' argument. Because what that really means is that given a threat to the state, most people believe that the state can demand their lives. It can demand that their lives be given over. Right? And this usually happens in the context of war, right? So in the context of war, the state can demand that your life be given for it, right? This is, dying in war. We believe this. At least most of us believe this, that the state can demand that you go and die to protect it, given a sufficient threat. And Socrates, of course, also believes this. But he takes the further step and he says that everybody believes that the state has the right to demand their life of them. Right? And this is the most that anything can demand. This is the most that any entity can demand of you, is your very life. That's the most. That's it. That's the limit. That's the limit of what you can give, and the state asks for that. It asks for that right. And we as a people concede and agree that it has that right. Well, Socrates is saying that in the instance of him being imprisoned and waiting for his execution, that it's no different. Right? If the state has the right to demand my life for its protection in one instance, the state has the right to demand my life for its protection in any instance that it sees fit. Right? Because the state is separate from him, and he is subordinate to the state. So the argument here really is, if the state can demand your life in war, then the state can demand your life in this context, where the state is threatened by your disobedience, because disobedience to the state is always a form of rebellion. And when you are disobedient to the state, you set yourself as a person at war against the state, at war against the law. And so that, in essence, is his argument. And it's a powerful argument against civil disobedience, because the the premise is that any act of civil disobedience is in fact not civil, right? It's in fact an act of insurrection. And it's an act really of a traitor. That's Socrates' that's what's behind his argument here. He says to Crito, basically, I can't leave Crito. I have to take the hemlock and accept my execution, because if I left, that would be treason. And so, this is Crito. This is the argument against civil disobedience. This argument comes from the virtue ethics tradition. Right? We are going to be reading a response, and that response is going to come from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it's going to be a defense of civil disobedience, and it's going to come from the natural law tradition. Remember, we did a little bit of Aquinas, right? We looked at the natural law tradition. And his defense is going to come from the natural law tradition. He's going to be quoting, I believe, St. Augustine in his defense, and we're going to be reading the letter from the Birmingham jail, which is just brilliantly written, and we'll be discussing that one next time.